You're listening to News Talk Radio Guyana 103.1 FM and the Demerara Waves online news via Facebook, YouTube, and of course Twitter. The time in Guyana is 6:41 in Guyana, or 18 hours 41. It's now time to essentially bring you that promised panel discussion on electoral reform in Guyana, perspectives from the Electoral Reform Group, a non-governmental civil society organization. And as you know, this discussion comes against the backdrop of what we are currently seeing. That's efforts to amend Guyana's legislation. And that, of course, also coming against the background of the prolonged March 2, 2020 general and regional elections and the 5 month wait for the results of those polls. Joining us tonight on this discussion are two gentlemen. One, Mr. Lawrence Latchman Singh, he is the coordinator for the Electoral Reform Group, and also Mr. Desmond Thomas. He's an author on the subject of electoral reform, so we believe he's quite equipped, like the ERG believes, to deal with the subject at hand. So, gentlemen, welcome to this edition of this discussion focusing on electoral reform in Guyana.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis.
First of all, for our listeners, what essentially is the ERG? Because you're pretty much a brand new organization, although you have been around for a few months well. But just a refresher, what's the ERG, or the Electoral Reform Group, all about?
Thanks, Dennis, and good night to all your viewers tonight and listeners, of course. You're right, the Electoral Reform Group is a relatively new group. We were just launched last December. We comprise about 40 members. These are Guyanese at home and abroad who are just concerned, good citizens concerned about electoral affairs in Guyana. Many of us go back a long, long time. So even though the group is new, many of us have been working on fair elections in Guyana for decades. I myself just realized I celebrated 30 years, my anniversary this year. 30 years of association with the free and fair election movement in Guyana. So our concern is not just about 2020, although 2020 was a big sort of blip on the electoral radar. But we're generally concerned about trying to reform the electoral process in a way that uses dialogue, that facilitates engagement across stakeholders who have, for decades now, been making recommendations, very good ones, that could address a lot of the dilemmas that our elections present. We are an elected group, so Desmond and I are part of a seven-person board. We call it the core group that manage the affairs of the group. And actually, AGM is coming up next month, so we are also a democratic group. We have internal elections. We believe in a democratic way of working. It's a challenge, of course. Democracy is not a straightforward thing, but taking the time to dialogue with each other, I think, has helped us as a group. And so, yeah, in a nutshell, Dennis, that's the ERG. We are available for those who would like to learn more about us on Facebook, Electoral Reform Group, as well as electoralreformgy.org. And if folks want to make contact at any point in time, if they want to send an email, electoralreformgy@gmail.com. So thanks for the opportunity to be here, and thanks for the opportunity to introduce our group.
Well, by virtue of Lawrence's own introduction about the ERG, he also said a bit about himself. As many of you may recall, he had been involved in what had been then known as the Electoral Assistance Bureau back in the late 80s to early 1990s, looking at the creation of a clean voters list and all of that, management of elections from a non-governmental perspective. But so much so for Lawrence. Mr. Thomas, who who are you, Dr. Thomas, as far as electoral reform is concerned?
Well, yeah, I'm a concerned citizen, just like Lawrence and the rest of the group. One thing I should say, I have written a book on electoral reform, but I need to give a disclaimer in the sense that I'm an economist, not a political scientist. So I'm kind of dwelling on some on a new territory, if you want to put it that way. But however, my approach to this subject is informed by my economics background. It comes essentially from the concern I have that Guyana, with all our advantages and with all our endowments as a country, Guyana is the best way for me to describe Guyana is as a gift. It's a country of abundance, of beauty, and all kinds of things. And yet we have underperformed as a country. Nobody can deny that. And so the question is, where does this underperformance come from? And my best explanation for it is, that our political environment has failed us. In other words, the problem is the way we manage our affairs, the way we integrate with each other, the way we work with each other, or fail to. And so that is what has kind of motivated my interest in this subject. And coming out of that is just two main ideas. One is, well, two or three. One is that that electoral reform is an important, a key step towards healing and fixing the country. The second thing is, and this is perhaps a little bit more controversial. We talk about our problems, and of course, the one that everybody jumps on immediately is the racial division. I do not think that Guyana's problems are unique. Guyana's problems are not unique, and we can find solutions. And this is where what we are interested in. It's not just talking about a problem, but what are the solutions? And the third thing is that the solution must, as Lawrence just pointed out, must involve civil society. Civil society, we can't just depend on politicians to fix our problems. We must be involved as civil society along with the politicians. So those are my that's my background, so to speak. I'm an economist, as I said. I've been I do some teaching at UG, so some of my students, if they're watching, they would recognize my voice at least. And I do some I'm teaching elsewhere. I've taught at the University of West Indies, and I've been also an economist for the Inter-American Development Bank. So that's my background. I've had some other connections as well.
Okay, great. So, gentlemen, we know all that had transpired dating back to March 2, 2020, particularly after polling day with respect to the tallying of the votes, the declaration of results. So I think we had at least two declarations by the Guyana Elections Commission on what had transpired in Region 4. We know all about the recount process. So essentially, no need to rehash all of those day by day. But since then, we have seen the Guyana government circulating a draft Representation of the People Act, amendment to the Representation of the People Act. We have had comments back and forth by the government and the opposition. My question to you, gentlemen, is whether you believe that this approach being taken by the government is indeed the correct one. That is to say, simply propose some amendments, circulate the bill for public comment, and then eventually meet with the stakeholders, either on paper or face to face, and then go to Parliament and let the votes in the House decide. Do you think that this is the best approach? If not, what's yours? Lawrence?
So thank you, Dennis. I think it's important to put the current reform process in context. A reform process is a complex thing. It involves administrative, institutional, legal, constitutional aspects to it. This step of amending the electoral legislation or the Representation of the People Act is a first step. But I think our view is that we hope it's not the only step. It would have been good if we could have had an inclusive process to kind of begin the discussion together. As it is, we can see that the process has already created some sort of discussion in the society, which is part of the democratic process. but it doesn't necessarily have a place to land in terms of a face-to-face discussion. So you're having like what we're having tonight, right? A media type of engagement and people sort of like playing tennis, right? Back and forth, back and forth. But where do we land in terms of building a consensus on the wisest approaches to the pressing electoral problems that we know exist? Um, so that was be one of the first things, is that to say that the process, whilst it has begun, cannot end with the Representation of the People Act amendments alone. So that's one. Two, I think we would really call on the government to give serious consideration to extending this process and to widening the spaces for us to all come together and discuss what is really needed, or whether on ROPA or the myriad of other issues that have emerged over the years from observers, um, interested persons, citizens, and so on. Like, for example, the composition of GCOM, how that is configured along party lines, is something that has come up from the Electoral Assistance Bureau. As you mentioned, decades ago, this recommendation came forward. Carter Center has observed that that is something that really needs to change. The CARICOM folks have mentioned this. Many groups, that's just one. Political party reform. How are political parties configured and how do they function? How do they fund their campaigns? How do they account for campaign financing? All of these things are important elements of the Electoral Administrative Act, or what you call ROPA. And these are not necessarily a part of the current amendment process. So we would certainly urge the government to consider lengthening the 6 week period that is almost halfway done already, and to also create more spaces for us to talk to each other face to face. This working indirectly with each other through the media, I think, is a recipe for confrontation. It doesn't help us to reach a consensus, which is ultimately what is needed in a political reform process that involves an election. So let me pause on that. I'm sure Desmond has other points to add.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I would just kind of complement what you just said. I believe that the publication of this amendment, this set of amendments, is a moment of opportunity. Okay, it is good that this process has started. It means, in a sense, that we have a process in taking place. But the thing is, we are not satisfied that this process, as it stands, is adequate. So and I would make one correction, and that is, there's a tendency out there to think of the motivation behind this whole thing, the trigger being last year's crisis. But the fact of the matter is, we have to go beyond. We've been in this kind of political jungle for a long time. I mean, last year was just bound to happen because it was a symptom rather than a cause. I would go back as far as, look at the problems over the no confidence motion. No confidence motions happen all over the Caribbean, and yet they don't end up in the kind of crisis, extended crisis, as what we had. You have the no confidence motion. You can go back and back and back. Every election there are disputes. No election. First of all, the election results take 2 weeks for you to know the result of an election. That shouldn't be happening. So the problem with the present set of amendments is that we're dealing with a whole quagmire of institutional weaknesses, and the present amendments end up being far too narrowly focused in one area. If we want to, we should be focused on reform that is going to change the conditions. And there are lots of things. Lawrence mentioned a few of them. Lots of things that need to be addressed in order to really do that. The election of the GCOM chairman, GCOM itself, the composition, the structure of GCOM is just dysfunctional. It will never work. A GCOM should not be an organization that operates on the basis of one vote determining the outcome. GCOM should be an organization that works by consensus. It should be able, we should, and that will call definitely for an important civil society component in it. In most countries, that's how the electoral commission works. It works by consensus. Where 6 or 7 people may trash something out, and they come out with a solid agreement by all 6. And that is where we want to go. That is where we want to go.
No, you're not. Yes, my question to you really is whether you believe that, first of all, organizations such as yours, the Guyana Elections Commission, probably some of the political players, should have been first consulted before the draft amendments to the Representation of the People Act were actually developed and circulated. Or you believe that this is the best approach with the executive taking the decision to circulate the draft? This is notwithstanding the fact that you have
Yeah.
already said, Dr. Thomas, that we had to start somewhere, and it is good that there's a start.
Dennis, I don't think we should get into the business of judging the process. It started where it started. You can argue, should GCOM have led this process? There's all kinds of ifs and buts, but I would just sort of like highlight, we're not starting from scratch. And the reasons why we're asking for more time is that government, as the lead on the reform so far, has had many months to come up with the amendments which are now out there. I think it's actually doing citizens a disservice. And I would point, of course, to Article 13, which is calling on citizens to be involved in key decision-making processes of the state that affect the well-being of citizens. Now, this is obviously one of those. Elections affect citizens at large in a very significant way. So I'm hoping that whilst we may be off to a bit of a rocky start in terms of the back and forth and the absence of a place to really negotiate what are the best ways forward, what's missing, what needs to be added, blah, blah, blah. I think it's not too late. And that's why we would urge that some consideration be given to amending the process that allows for more time and that creates formal spaces for stakeholders. Let's bring civil society together to discuss. Let's bring the parties together in a different space to discuss. Maybe we could bring them all together. What about the private sector? What about the indigenous people? What about community groups? Let's try and achieve a national consensus on how we move forward on elections. None of us wants to go back to 2020 or even further back. We really want to move forward. And as Dr. Thomas has said, elections are standing in the way of us moving forward as a country. We have a wonderful opportunity with the windfalls from oil and gas, not to mention gold and bauxite and all of these other things before. We are standing on the precipice of incredible development as a country. We need to have a development process that I think citizens will then be able to live peacefully with each other, appreciate political processes, join in them, contribute to the development process. That's not an impossible thing to do. I know it's sometimes hard to do when people are shouting at you in the public space, when you call a meeting and people are behaving X, Y, and Z. That's okay. That's part of the democratic process. I think what we're looking for is really an extension and a broadening of the discussion so that it's not in these ping pong matches in public, but rather in a space where we can negotiate, accommodate, discuss, appreciate, and decide in a way that allows us all to live with whatever comes forward. So I don't want to judge the current process. It's a start. We needed a start. So we got the start. Let's see how we can build on that.
Within the last few minutes, you have remarked, though, that you want to create the space and essentially it will be better off than people exchanging views in the public. This leads me to the next question. Has the Electoral Reform Group been provided with a copy of the draft proposed amendments to the Representation of the People Act?
We've seen copies, haven't we? I mean, I think it's a public document, isn't it?
Yeah, but what I'm trying to get from you is whether the government has provided you with this copy or you had to go eking it out on your own.
Yeah, Dennis. No, we did not receive it directly from the government. We got it, as I suppose you did, through public means.
All right. Have you looked at the proposed amendments to the Representation of the People Act? What are your general thoughts initially, and then we'll go into some finer details.
Yeah. Well, maybe I could jump in. You may have seen a letter to the media that I wrote about a week ago, in which basically, the view was expressed that the problem with the idea that the proposed amendments are too narrowly focused. The idea is that they seem to, in my mind, to aggravate, to be likely to aggravate the kind of back and forth between the parties, rather than leading to a kind of consensus process. So the focus is on what happened in 2020. The focus is on raising penalties against some staff members of GCOM, all right? When in fact, when it comes to electoral malfeasance, which we have no shortage of experience with, there are many angles to it, and many. So the if you look at the way in which the provisions where the penalties have been increased dramatically, for breaking the law, so to speak, they're very selective. So they aim at primarily at staff members of GCOM, but there are other provisions in the existing act that have not been touched in terms of more punishment. So the whole problem is a very narrow focus on punishing people rather than creating an improved electoral environment. And things like campaign financing, the need for something that I think people would want is an electoral system where the representative and the citizens represented have a closer and more direct relationship. So things like that need to be addressed, and these amendments don't touch those things at all.
Lawrence?
Dennis, I don't know if you picked up earlier this week, the Latin American Public Opinion Project actually released data on its 2021 poll, which includes Guyana. There's 20-something countries involved in this poll. It's actually quite worrying. And if I could use that poll to try and represent the concerns of citizens at large, Guyana is at the very bottom of the scale in terms of confidence that the votes have been counted accurately. Guyana, Jamaica, and I think it's Colombia. Only 18% of citizens feel that votes are always counted accurately. There are continued other measures in that poll that give concern that citizens have lost confidence in the Electoral Administration. 15 years ago, when the Latin American Public Opinion poll was done, there were also concerns, but it wasn't this bad. It was more like 50%, not 18% as it is now. So you can see a gradual sliding of public confidence in the integrity of the electoral process. Of course, last year's incident would have contributed significantly to this. My point is, and Dr. Thomas's point, is that we need to do a whole range of things to increase public confidence in the electoral process. There's no point having an elections if a significant amount of people don't believe the results are fair. But for us to get to that promised land, we're going to have to look back at documents like this, right? EAB pulled together a 20-year compendium of reforms from 1992 to 2011. The international community has been doing the same thing for 15, 20 years. The reforms that we need are already documented. There's not a lot of contention that we need to work on the voters list. We need to work on the advantages of being the government when you're running a campaign. We have to look at politics in GCOM. We have to look at a whole range of things that connect. It's important that we look at abuses, um, and making sure that staff understand that they are accountable. People must feel like they're working for a higher standard. But that's only one issue. And our concern is, whilst that may be a major concern of the government now, we need to add other important conversations to the process so that we achieve a larger range of reforms that together are going to add up to increase public confidence in election results. That is ultimately what an elections process is supposed to do. So we're all of us are on the same page on this. I don't think there's anybody in the political system that is going to disagree that we should be working to increase citizens' confidence in those election results so that after an election, we can move on. We can appreciate who has how many votes, and we can start to work together in a truly cooperative way in this cooperative republic of ours. So, just in a nutshell, I think we have a lot of material already. What we need is a space to table it, discuss it, see what's been working, what's not been working. This is a start, but we need to move on, and we think we need more time, and we need other elements in a process to help us foster that consensus.
Has the Electoral Reform Group made known its concerns to the government of Guyana?
Um, okay, I just specifically on that, I think we've engaged the government. We've certainly let them know that we're here. We've actually written to all the political parties so they know we are around. They understand our role. We have tried to explain that we are a non-partisan, non-governmental group, as you mentioned in your introduction. Um, we have not had the opportunity directly, but again, that's not our role. We are trying to represent and use a bottom up process. COVID has really hit us hard. And I'm not making excuses for the fact that we haven't been able to reach citizens as much as we would have liked. But there is something that we still need to do. And I think as ERG, we must be responsible for the fact that we need to also do more as a group to facilitate people participating in these processes more and more. Um, I'm not ashamed to say we don't have money. We don't have no big donor funding us. So we do what we can within the limited resources, whether money or time or people. And we've reached out to four regions so far. As I mentioned, we have this group of comrades who help us, give us moral support, financial support. But we need to do more. So it's not just the political system that is challenged. I think we should also be humble enough to admit that as a civil society group, along with other civil society groups, we also have a lot of work to do. Um, COVID, again, I don't want to make excuses. COVID has definitely held us back. We had to be sensitive. There are some new places we went, people could not meet in large enough numbers. We have to do more. But that, I think, is our challenge. And I think it's our challenge together with government to find ways of enhancing everybody's participation in the process.
But so, Dr.
Yeah,
Thomas,
but I think just to add something, I think you know, it should be mentioned that we actually wrote to the minister, to the attorney general, um, on this matter of on this process. We wrote a letter to the attorney general, outlining very briefly our concerns and the desire that the emphasis on a consultative process, and the desire that we should, and our availability to participate. We actually wrote to and we never got a response. So I mean, we have done our bit in terms of that kind of information. We're doing our thing, but it depends on the rest of the process.
do I get the impression, Lou, what you're actually calling for as well as part of the body of your suggestions or recommendations is a sort of a national conference on electoral reform or a national stakeholder meeting?
I personally believe that something like that is an important, is somewhere where we want to go. I believe that some kind of consultative body or assembly process, and that is definitely, because it's worked in other countries, in other places that have had this kind of crisis. one of the interesting things about Guyana's political problems is there are two things I'd like to mention here. One is we've had these kind of problems for 6 years. The one thing we've been at each other's throats. We simply have never sat down, sit down, break bread, talk to each other about the problems, and it's something we can do because whether people like it or not or agree with it, the fact of the matter is we have outside of the politics we have congenial relations, that what I consider to be congenial relations. In other parts of the world people are killing one another. At least we haven't gotten to that stage. So we need to move to that process where we sit and just try to trash out our problems. And that, I think, is what Lawrence meant by finding the kind of space for that kind of event to take place. The second thing connected to that is this, though. There is a lot of um, um, skepticism about what we're trying to do because there's a lack of faith. People feel you're bound to fail. This is Guyana, it isn't going to happen. And that skepticism, which is fueled, mind you, by some quarters, right, is really a big challenge that we have to deal with. To bring people into an environment and the whole process needs to pay attention to that. In this whole thing about electoral reform, the process is just as important as the outcome.
If you don't, well, you said you have not gotten a reply from the Attorney General, and the time is certainly ticking. As Lawrence quite rightly pointed out, you're the halfway mark of the 6-week period of consultation. To what extent do you plan to make your observations known about the draft representation of the proposed amendment, to the Representation of the People Act known to the government through some sort of document or by any
Yeah.
other means?
Thanks, Dennis. You've given me a good opportunity to mention some of our current work, which is happening around the amendment process. We are currently analyzing all the recommendations that using categories like GCOM, voters list, campaigning, and so on, and analyzing the reforms from the perspective of what others have wisely proposed over the years to see what's been captured by the current amendments and what is still to be done. I don't, unfortunately, have a timeline to give you as to when that could be done. It's a lengthy process because, as you can imagine, there's a lot to be considered over the decades. But we did have a head start. We had started doing the analysis before. So one of the specific things we would want to do is actually create a written response that we would share with the stakeholders, including the government, for consideration. Hopefully, that can then lead to some of the ideas like you've suggested of a conference or smaller groups that work and then feed it upwards into a conference. We do need to find a way of coming together. And I think if you look at the process so far, it is very much, obviously a government-led process. But I think the government would appreciate that there is actually some significant benefits to increasing the amount of participation and giving a little bit more time. We're not talking about 2-3 years. Give it a little bit more time so that people could understand what really is needed and lend their support to it, so that when the amendments go to Parliament, whether they're electoral, legislation related, or constitutional, the support would be there because the citizens have given their support for it, and in that way lent some kind of support for the elected representatives to vote for reforms in Parliament. I guess maybe I could also mention that one of the big things that we hope that the subsequent phase of reforms would look at is the actual electoral system, which is not in Europa. How does the connection between the voter and who is elected get stronger? How do voters relate closer to representatives who live near to them? or who relate to them on a regular basis, who have, for example, constituency offices, or who respond to the imperatives of local needs. Currently, our electoral system, I don't want to go down too far down that road. I just want to mention as an example that for us at ERG, the electoral administration is an important element that gets us towards improved mechanics of an elections process. But the whole system, how parliament is configured, how the representatives are held accountable to citizens, what's the linkage, what's the loyalty factor, who is loyal to who. And that is something that I think is not on the table right now, but in subsequent steps in this reform process, we are hoping that election systems can actually be touched upon by policymakers in partnership with citizens.
You're talking about that. Give us a little bit more time. What are you looking at in terms of a duration?
We don't have a time to propose, Dennis. That would be something we would hope could be discussed also. We don't have a strong sense. We haven't ourselves engaged other stakeholders to try and develop a timeline. We're floating an extension as an idea. Let's see what others say. If other civil society groups, you'd be keen to hear their views. Political parties, of course, and just even the media. What does everybody think about a possible extension? Well, we don't have a number to propose.
At what stage will you be engaging the other civil society organizations and the political parties to try to get a body of views or a position to say, okay, you need more time. Let's ask for more time. You're quite rightly saying that you're halfway through the 6 week period. When are you going to start this process of getting, some sort of consensus among your colleague NGOs and the political parties?
Desmond, I don't know if you want to take that one. We have reached out to civil society groups, but not on this specific point. We are trying to see if civil society groups can work together. But it's a good question, Dennis, because I think we need to sort of help build a consistent kind of a consensus, even on the extension. Unfortunately, with the limited time available, I doubt if we would have the capacity to really reach out to all of the stakeholders you mentioned. So hopefully through mediums like yours, the message can get out and folks can consider it. And hopefully, we will do our bit. But I want to caution, I mean, ERG is not, a ministry or a commission or anything like that. You see us here tonight. We are two very tired soldiers working very hard, doing the best we can. And hopefully the message goes out and people can discuss the idea of an extension, and hopefully it can land in government to receive a receptive audience.
Okay, it's a good time to remind our viewers and listeners that we're listening to a live discussion on electoral reform in Guyana, perspectives from the Electoral Reform Group, a civil society non-governmental organization that is essentially mandating itself to not only look at the current issues facing Guyana's electoral system, but going back to its genesis, way back to the 80s and the 90s, and also a number of the observer mission reports and local, positions that have been taken over the decades. So the participants in the discussion tonight are the coordinator of the Electoral Reform Group, Mr. Lawrence Lashman Singh, and also a member of that group, Dr. Desmond Thomas. Now we go specifically to the Representation of the People Act. What do you make, for instance, of the proposal that Region 4 should be divided into sub-districts to at least create a better management of the counting process after votes would have been cast? Well, of course, not only after, but of course the casting of the votes and also the counting of the votes after.
Yeah, if I might jump in on that one, this is an example of the superficiality of the whole amendment process. Region 4 is the biggest region in the country, but it's 200,000 people. You have those kind of numbers in a city in some parts of the world. Not only that, but it's the region at the center. It's the urban region. So it's the region that is closest to. So the idea of kind of um, targeting regions for I don't know how well that is going to go down. But it's interesting about the question of, of the breaking up, because this is a missed opportunity. Because what needs to happen? We need more constituencies. You see, Region 4 is being broken up for administrative purposes, but it's still one constituency. And I think that what we need are more constituencies, so that the people in the constituency are closer to their representative. What's interesting about Region 4? Region 4 goes from what, to Temeri to Mahaika, right? Which means that the representatives of Region 4 are representing Buxton, BV, Golden Grove on the east coast, Georgetown. When you have such different communities so far away from each other, it is hard to imagine that kind of, because their interests and their needs are different. So you want to have an electoral system that makes the connection between the communities and the people who represent them. So it's an interesting question, but it really shows that really the motivation, the emphasis on punishment and so on, is really missing the opportunity to really make transformative change to the electoral system.
Lawrence, do you support the breaking up of Region 4 into four sub-districts?
Dennis, I'm not actually able to answer the question because actually this is a new idea that has been tabled. I've checked, I can't find any previous recommendations suggesting that this approach would address the election results challenge, which I'm assuming is part of the reason why the reform has been proposed. 2 points. Again, if we could just sit together, understand the thinking, discuss what is the problem we're trying to fix here. If the problem is to do with the speed and accuracy and sort of credibility of the Region 4 results, along with all the other 9 regions, why are we not yet talking about transparency, for example, or the increased use of technology to help us achieve that? There have been recommendations constantly over the years. Why is GCOM, just as an example, right? Why is GCOM not able to put polling station data online? Why is it only posted on the wall of the polling station? Could they not, for transparency's sake, using technology, upload all the data right there? Use whatever means. Let citizens see that online. Let them walk over to the polling station and verify that that is actually correct. Let's build public confidence using tools that are available. I can't assess the proposed, and ERG has not interrogated the specifics of that proposal. Partly because I don't think it's ever been tabled as a solution like that before. But my point would also be, let's not do these things in a vacuum. Let's come together and sit down. Maybe there's another way, a previously recommended way or a new way that can address whatever the underlying concerns are. And certainly, I'm sure that we can find solutions. Somewhere out there, if we can put our heads together, we're going to find that technology, transparency, and a number of other tools can assist us in getting to the promised land of election results that are considered credible by the majority, if not all, of our citizens.
But Lawrence and Dr. Thomas, you would agree that the proposed amendments do take into consideration the use of technology as far as the processing of the results right up to the point of posting it on the Elections Commission's website. So,
I
don't
don't.
you?
Just double check, Dennis. Is that actually on the night of the election, like right at the close of poll, or is that after it has gone through and wended its way through a process of counting and tap? Like we
One
had
gets the
last.
impression. One gets the impression that through the supernumerary returning officers, that eventually will be trickled right up the chain to the returning officer, who will then transmit that to the chief election officer for posting on the GCAP website. So really and truly, it seems that part of your
Perhaps,
suggestion of the
perhaps.
use of technology
Yeah.
appears to be built in that amendment. Um, do you know, for instance, at what stage you will actually be able to give a concrete position on, you know, these proposed amendments, like this one, for instance, which is a crucial one? It has already generated a lot of debate in the country
Yeah.
among opposition stakeholders, especially. And I think the government has also reacted to it very sharply, saying that the intent is not to, in any way, alter the number of seats in the National Assembly, but it appears as though it's just a matter of convenience given the experiences of Region 4. At what stage will your organization be able to give a definitive position on this particular amendment?
Dennis, I just want to make sure I'm managing your expectations here. ERG is not setting itself up as some kind of technically expert group. We are fundamentally a dialogue group that is trying to foster the coming together of groups. So that's one of the reasons, for example, why you haven't heard us jumping up and down in public, making a whole heap of public noises about things. We are actually trying to be in the middle, fostering a better way of moving forward together. We are going to do our technical work, but I don't think it's going to have that kind of strength of opinion where we say this is right and this is wrong, or this is better and this is worse. We're going to try and present, just as EAB has done over the years, just as the observers have done over the years, dispassionately present what's needed in terms of solutions and what are options for getting there. And let a process. Dr. Thomas made a really crucial point earlier. The outcome is the process is more important than the outcome. Once we have an honest process, we cannot predetermine outcomes. We have to let that process unfold and let the consensus land where it will. But if we don't give the consensus a chance to land, then it's going to be me saying something, Dr. Thomas saying something, Dennis saying something, and we're all over the place, but we don't have a way of reconciling. And eventually what happens? Whoever's strongest or whoever has the most votes in parliament or whoever, whatever, makes a decision in the absence of the consensus. A political process like this really can't afford to move forward in a fragmented fashion where people are pulling in different directions. That is precisely why ERG was set up, to try and bring us together. I know it sounds a bit romantic. People might say it's wishy-washy. It's certainly needed. We're committed to that. We believe in that. And that's how we're going to approach it. So we will do our technical work, to recap, but I don't imagine we're going to be taking strong positions in the absence of a process.
Yeah.
Dr.
Yeah.
Thomas, your organization is all. Go ahead, sir. You're about to say something, Dr. Thomas?
No, no. Basically, just to kind of follow up on that, we're not. We all have our ideas or views about what is required. Everybody has views, but we are not about prescription right now. We are about bringing about that process that involves civil society in a more meaningful way. And one of the things that is important here is this: we recognize that moving the whole electoral reform process forward will call for a lot of education. There is a role for people to have a better understanding of how the existing system works and how to get to those objectives that we want to achieve, right? So, there is that kind of role, but at the moment, the important thing is to get the information and the engagement going.
If you don't get the engagement, what happens?
Well, that is, I don't think that a process without engagement. Look, Article 13 of our Constitution mandates the government, the parliament, to proceed by a process of engagement consultation with the citizenry, and so that is already written into the law. The question is, how do we follow that? And the quality of that engagement is what is important. You can have a process and you say we consulted this body, we consulted that body, and then you go to parliament and by one seat, you win the process. No, the quality of the engagement, and as I said before, to a large extent, let us see if we can get to a process which is based on consensus, get to a process of understanding and consensus. And I don't think it's impossible.
If you
Yeah.
don't get if you don't get a meeting of minds, or you get a meeting of minds that is not necessarily in keeping with the expectations, to what extent will the electoral reform group be challenging this process in the courts on the basis of Article 13 of the Guyana Constitution that requires, inclusivity and all of that?
Dennis, our plan, with or without, whether we are taken seriously or whether we listen to or any of these process questions, we have a plan. And as I mentioned before, COVID has thrown us off, or resources have thrown us off. But with or without any changes to the process, our intention remains the same: to start trekking around the country, to have a robust engagement plan and strategy, to talk to citizens across the country and try and jazz up their interest, their enthusiasm and to get their own thoughts on the specifics of what we need. We have no way of knowing what the government is going to eventually do. Will they extend this? Will they broaden this process? But we would like to go back to basically our dialogue roots and start talking to people across the regions, including, the far off regions, but of course not forgetting those outside of Region 4, to find out, what are their own concerns, just like the LAPOP poll has done. But let's get more specific. And what do people feel are the solutions? And we will do our best in a very honest and transparent way to amplify those views, to share those views with the stakeholders. And we can only hope at a certain point that some of this affects the body politic in a way that allows for greater inclusion and a little more gentleness of process in terms of looking at this reform in a way that is more inclusive. Going to court, I don't know if anybody has thought about that. Nobody in our group has mentioned that. It's not something that I imagine would be on the top of our list. I think we would be, rather than going down that road, I think we'd much rather go down the road to see our fellow citizens, hear from them, and try to involve them. As I mentioned, we ourselves can take some blame. We should have been doing this a little while now. We could have perhaps done a bit more. We're asking the government to consider expanding that space. Hopefully, COVID will give us a break. But now that the reforms have been tabled, there is a little momentum. We can take advantage of that and try to talk to citizens, get their perspectives. And our duty will be to feed that to the process. We can write to the minister. We can ask for meetings with folks in government. We can convene political parties individually, whatever, just to share in respect, to find a way of working together. So the idea of confrontation is not really part of our modus operandi. In fact, one of our members said we are civil society, so we should at least be civil. We will try to work. I'm not saying that we at some point wouldn't get vexed about something and carry on. But I hope not. We are working hard to try and foster a consensus. So to sort of be brief about it now, we need to get out there. We need to talk to citizens. We've started, but we need to do more.
Gentlemen, one of the issues that is always on the front burner of the politicians is this whole question of cleaning up the voters list. We have seen court judgments about the status of the national database of the registrar of registrants, and um, what do you think should be done to clean up the voters list? Broadly speaking, I know you said you don't want to necessarily to commit yourself to position, but these are burning issues in the society, which a society also wants to hear you speak on as a member of civil society. So, critically, what should be the approach both legislatively and otherwise. Moving forward, probably local government elections may come our way in the not too distant future. So, have you addressed your mind to how this voters list could be cleaned up?
The that's the kind of question that I think we are not focused on, because the technicalities of cleaning up the voters list and so on, all that is that's the work of the electoral commission. All right. And so the hope is that we can have an electoral commission that is capable of dealing with things like that can make up its mind and reach consensus on things like that. And what's an important corollary to that is this: that the present amendments put a lot of emphasis on punishment and penalties, but perhaps not enough attention to the training, the capacity building, and so on that needs to happen in the electoral commission and in the management of elections. So, I frankly, I don't think we've really discussed the details of the electoral list. We know that it's an issue, and we know that it concerns Guyanese people, and we know that it needs to be addressed. All right, but it's a technical matter, and it needs to be addressed frontally by the Electoral Commission, specifically in terms of having the capacity to do it. The one of the things about
Yeah,
Guyana, just as a final thing, one of the things about Guyana is we have the laws. We have in certain areas, we have laws that govern these things. But then we go ahead and we just ignore the law that's supposed to deal with it. So
well, what I'm
that
trying
is
to get from you, do you believe that there should be house to house registration to clean up the list, or should it be through the continuous registration process, or a combination of both?
Dennis, I think we're going to stand on the ground of process here, and we're not on shaky ground here. The OAS, the Commonwealth Secretariat over the years have been calling for stakeholders to come together and discuss this issue. Right? Remember, we had issues with who's a registrant and what to do with the folks in the diaspora. What do we do with persons who have died, who don't live here anymore? Those things are fundamentally policy issues that political forces especially need to be involved in. It's not, we could come up with a technical remedy, but the process has led us to a conclusion that, look, we got to bring people together. I know it's frustrating for you. You want a clean answer that says, well, ERG says we must fix this list like this or that. That's not our role. Our role is to encourage that the stakeholders come together and discuss it. And we're not alone on that. As I mentioned, the OAS, Commonwealth Secretariat, even EAB over the years. One, I remember, I'll give you, when I was a young man with EAB 25 years ago, I went to Barbados and I saw how they do their voters list over there. That was 27 years ago, Dennis. They have a wonderful system. We could look at these examples. We came back and we put it in an EAB report calling for one list that covers the entire country. We don't have an NIS list and a TIN number and a passport number. We have one list that is cleansed collectively and consistently over time. Building public confidence in any list is going to be a challenge. So we have to have the political sort of support for that from the political process. And there are a number of technical remedies that we can effect. I've heard a number of really good ideas over the years. Let's just go to those now, man. Let me just go and talk about these things that have already been tabled, find ways to incorporate them into the decision-making process, and let's all get on with life after that. The list needs to be fixed. Something needs to be done. Obviously there are concerns, but the solution is not necessary for us to give our opinion on that. Let the stakeholders come together and do the hard work of debating it, negotiating it, and coming to a consensus on it. That's what a democracy really ought to do. And really, we're not asking for, a particular point. We're just saying, look, can we just talk about this, please?
Yeah, but without a definitive position, of course, it may lead to the perception that your organization is ambivalent about certain things, and people across the board would like to know that you're standing there on the side of particular positions and principles that will altogether lead to the view that the system needs to be cleaned up and respected by all as one that is credible.
We
So,
don't, there's no ambivalence about that. Dennis, with
when
all
are
due respect.
you going to be are you going to be relying on yet another round of talks and talks and talks without taking a position in anything?
I think that
No,
is what a lot of
y-
people would like us to do. Eh?
yeah, no, but I don't think that that is a fair, um, description of the situation. It's not that we are shirking or running away from taking a position on things. It is, one of the problems with this country, with Guyana and Guyana's whole political system, is the polarization. The whole country is divided down the middle. One of the interesting things is that the election results, for example, in 2015, more than 99% of the population voted for either the one party or the other. Okay, so the problem with that is that the moment you take a stand on something, you are cast as being in this camp or that camp. We are not into that kind of. We are non-partisan, and what we want to do is to really focus on getting to a solution. And the solution does not necessarily mean one side or the other. There are other solutions, and so I don't think it's, if what we want is a, a solution, a credible solution to the question of the voters list. We agree it's an issue and it needs to be fixed. But then for me to say that, for you to put us in the position where it boils down to this solution or that, when there may be three others, is where we have a problem. Okay, let us. We support the idea of a voters list solution that is fair and credible, and that will get the job done. And that is not
Gentlemen,
short of our responsibility.
quickly a wrap up comments as we bring the curtains down in this discussion.
Thanks, Dennis,
First,
and thanks again
Dr.
for.
Talbot.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Ed.
Yeah, well, I first of all, I have to thank you for this opportunity, um, to hear our views, and uh, you know, we emphasize process. Part of the process is this kind of engagement, this kind of a opportunity to express our views, have a discussion. It's happening around the one of the things that gives me a lot of hope and a lot of optimism is that this is happening more than a fair amount around the media environment right now. There's a lot of discussion about our political conditions, and that can only lead in a positive direction. So thank you for the opportunity. I think that beyond the technicalities, one of the main challenges is the skepticism, the fear, the feeling that people have that um, that things are not going to change, that things cannot change. Um, but I think that some of the younger people are more positive about what should happen, and I think that that is what we want to encourage. Okay, and let's stay positive.
Lawrence.
Dennis, thanks again for having us on the show. Let's do this more often. Perhaps we can interrogate a little bit more about the processes, because I would want to reiterate that we feel that this is an important step that's been taken, but it can't be the last step. It's a first step, and the processes need to be unfolded to give us a larger range of reforms that strengthen GCOM, strengthen the AG's chambers, that strengthen the Constitution, and not just the Electoral Administration Act. And also, we feel, and I think we've been quite clear in saying that whilst these reforms are certainly worth discussing, a lot is missing. A lot of key things that have been observed and identified over the years are missing still. So we're asking for an opportunity. We're asking the government to consider expanding and extending this process to give us a fulsome discussion, allow for all of the inputs to come together in a way that builds a consensus so that whatever reforms are eventually approved have the benefit of broad popular support, and we don't go into 2025 limping with reforms that are either unclear or unappreciated or whatever. Let's do what we can now. We still have time. It's 4 more years before 2025. Let's get this right, and let's do the other steps that are needed. The ERG is a young group. We're trying our best. We'll do even better, I'm sure, in our second year to help the process through engagements with citizens and education of citizens. So thanks again for the time. Thanks for your questions. I really appreciate the opportunity, and all the best to your viewers. Thanks to viewers for signing in, tuning in, and giving us a hearing. Really appreciate that, and we look forward to staying in touch. As I mentioned, if you want to do that, we are electoralreformgy@gmail.com. We're on Facebook, Electoral Reform Group, and also we have a website, electoralreformgy.org. So thank you and good night.
Thank you, Mr. Lawrence Lashman Singh, the coordinator for the non-governmental organization named the Electoral Reform Group, and also joining us in this discussion was Dr. Desmond Thomas, who is a member of that group. Gentlemen, do have a great night. This is Dennis Shabral, wishing you a great weekend. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you
Bye.
all. All right.
Hey, the chief.